and welcome. Tonight we drift to the banks of the Nile, where flood and desert shaped one of the longest stories in human history. There is nothing to memorize and nothing to solve. You are here to listen, breathe, and rest. We will move slowly through kings, temples, workers, rituals, and the long seasons of change that carried ancient Egypt across millennia. If sleep comes before the story ends, let it come. Close your eyes when you like, follow the rain, and we will begin. Tonight, we settle into a slower rhythm. We will not rush from name to name. We will pause where life was actually lived, near fields, workshops, kitchens, temple courtyards, and river docks where people measured the year by water, labor, and light. You do not need to hold every detail. Let each scene arrive softly, then pass. If your thoughts wander, that is perfectly fine. The story is designed to carry you gently, not to demand effort. As the rain continues, let your breathing slow. We begin with foundations, and from there we follow the long Egyptian arc across centuries of ambition, devotion, strain, renewal, and endurance. When people picture ancient Egypt, they usually picture pyramids. But the first chapter of Egypt is older and quieter than stone. It begins with water, mud, timing, and memory. It begins with the Nile. Most of Egypt is arid land. Dense settlement was possible mainly in two linked zones, the narrow river valley and the broad northern delta. This geography did not simply influence culture. It constrained and organized it. Food production, settlement size, transport routes, and political authority all had to adapt to one long ecological corridor. Each year the flood reshaped possibilities. Water rose, fields disappeared, then re-emerged under new layers of fertile silt. Planting and harvest followed that pulse. Floods were not perfectly stable, and difficult years occurred, but the cycle was regular enough to encourage planning across seasons rather than survival day by day. Planning produced administration. After flood retreat, boundaries had to be remeasured. Seed and grain stores had to be tracked. Labor had to be coordinated for embankments, canals, and local repair work. Boats had to move people and goods along the river in both directions. Over time, these repeated practical tasks generated habits of record-keeping and authority. This is one of the key ideas for understanding early Egypt. Institutions often begin as solutions to recurring logistical problems. A field cannot be planted from ideology alone. A grain store cannot be protected by prestige alone. People need predictable procedures, and predictable procedures effectually create offices, hierarchies, and systems of accountability. Early Nile communities did not begin as one unified kingdom. Regional centers developed their own local elites, ritual traditions, and power bases. In broad terms, two larger political spheres emerged, Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the delta. Interaction between them included trade, diplomacy, competition, and eventually domination. Later royal imagery presents unification as a clear symbolic achievement: one ruler, two lands, one ordered realm. That image matters, but it should not be mistaken for a one-day event. Unification was a process that required continual maintenance. Local elites had to be integrated. Transport corridors had to be controlled. Regional loyalties had to be managed without constant collapse into rivalry. By the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE, a more durable form of kingship appears. The decisive change was not merely that one person ruled. The decisive change was that rule became institutional enough to survive individual reigns. Succession, taxation, regional oversight, and symbolic legitimacy all became more structured. Religion was central to this structuring, but not as a decorative layer added after politics. Kingship was presented as guardian of order in both social and cosmic terms. In practice, this gave authority a shared language that linked local life with wider claims about justice, fertility, and continuity. Political obedience and ritual meaning reinforced each other. Geography made that reinforcement easier to administer. A river axis allows communication and transport efficiencies that fragmented landscapes do not. Boats could move heavy cargo farther and more reliably than overland routes in many periods. Administrators could inspect, report, and redistribute along a recognizable spine. At the same time, Egypt was never a sealed world. Contacts with Nubia to the south, Levantine zones to the northeast, and desert routes to the east and west shaped early development. Copper, stone, prestige goods, and technical knowledge moved across boundaries. State formation happened through interaction, not isolation. Household life also matters in this early phase. People married, inherited, farmed, crafted, and raised children within local communities that had their own rhythms. Centralization did not erase local identities. Instead, a long process unfolded in which local continuity and central authority learned to coexist under shared symbols. Evidence for these centuries remains uneven. Archaeological layers, iconography, royal lists, and later textual traditions do not always align cleanly. Scholars debate chronology and emphasis, yet the broad trajectory is strong. Ecological rhythm encouraged coordination, strengthened administrative capacity, and administrative capacity enabled durable kingship. If we listen carefully, the founding pattern is less dramatic than later monumentality, but no less impressive. Egypt did not appear fully formed. It was assembled over generations through repetition, flood, retreat, survey, planting, storage, transport, negotiation, ritual, and rule. That repetition is why this chapter matters. Every later development in the series, pyramid building, temple economies, military expansion, administrative stress, and political fragmentation rests on this initial achievement, converting seasonal uncertainty into long-term institutional order. Hold one image before we continue. The Nile is a moving calendar. Its water marked time, and time made coordination possible. Coordination became authority, and authority became civilization. In the next chapter, we move into the Old Kingdom, where these foundations are converted into one of the most visible demonstrations of state capacity in world history. Chapter 1 ended with a durable kingship taking shape. Chapter 2 shows what that kingship could do when central institutions were strong, predictable, and confident. The pyramids are the most visible result, but they are not the whole story. They are the surface of a deeper administrative system. The Old Kingdom is often treated as a golden age of centralized rule. That label can be useful if we define it carefully. It does not mean social harmony. It does not mean equality. It means that the court, provincial administration, and taxation networks were coordinated enough to sustain large projects over decades. The Fourth Dynasty provides the clearest case. Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure left monuments at Giza that remain globally recognizable. Yet the historical puzzle is not simply how large stones were stacked. The puzzle is institutional. How did a state repeatedly mobilize labor, food, transport, and specialized skill with enough reliability to complete these projects? Start with quarrying and movement. Limestone from local quarries, finer stone from farther sources, copper tools that needed maintenance, ropes, sledges, ramps, and boats, all required planning before any visible monument could rise. Work was not one uninterrupted push. It was phased, seasonal, and managed through layered chains of command. The Nile made this possible in practical terms. Transport by river reduced friction across long distances. Seasonal cycles helped schedule labor and supply movement. But river conditions alone do not build pyramids. Administrative decisions had to convert regional output into centrally timed effort. This is where scribes and officials become essential historical actors. Grain accounts, workforce rosters, delivery logs, and crew assignments turned resources into executable plans. The famous monument depended on the less famous record. In many ways, the Old Kingdom was a civilization of paperwork as much as of stone. Labor itself was varied. Modern myths often frame pyramid construction as purely slave labor. The evidence suggests a more complex and still deeply unequal system, corvée-like obligations, rotating teams, permanently attached specialists, support workers, and administrators. Skilled masons and planners worked alongside large labor contingents doing transport and preparation tasks. Complexity does not erase coercion. The system extracted from populations and redistributed according to political priorities. Yet it is more accurate to describe a managed labor regime than a single simplified model. That distinction matters because it reveals the actual structure of Old Kingdom state capacity. Food logistics were just as decisive as stone logistics. Large workforces needed regular rations, grain, beer, onions, fish, and other staples. Storage and delivery failures could halt progress quickly. So the pyramid zone functioned not merely as a construction site, but as an integrated provisioning environment connected to wider agricultural network. Monumental projects also served ideology. Royal tomb complexes, causeways, and associated temples created landscapes where kingship, ritual, and memory were joined. These spaces communicated permanence, hierarchy, and cosmic legitimacy. Even people far from Giza encountered the same message through local administration and state-supported ritual language. That ideological layer was not superficial propaganda added after construction. It helped stabilize extraction. If the ruler was framed as guarantor of order, then taxation, labor obligation, and ceremonial investment could be narrated as participation in a larger, moral system. Belief and bureaucracy worked together. Provincial elites were central to that partnership. The crown depended on them to implement directives in local settings. They depended on the crown for status, titles, and access to central favor. This mutual dependence made the system productive, but it also contained long-term tension. Local offices could accumulate autonomous power. In this sense, the Old Kingdom resembles many highly coordinated states in history. Strong central institutions can generate extraordinary achievements. They can also become vulnerable when fiscal pressure rises, when elite alignment weakens, or when extraction and legitimacy drift apart. A helpful image is to see the Old Kingdom as an engine rather than a static postcard. The engine had inputs, grain, labor, tools, and authority. It had transmission systems, scribal records, transport routes, and local offices. It had visible output, pyramids, and ceremonial complexes. As long as timing and trust held, the engine produced monumental results. Over time, however, even well-designed engines experienced strain. By the later Old Kingdom, historians identified growing signs of diffusion, expanding local elite power, administrative fragmentation in some regions, and mounting pressure on central integration. The pace and causes remain debated, but the direction is important for what follows. The major takeaway is clear. The pyramids are not only tombs and not only symbols. They are evidence of a political economy capable of concentrating resources at scale, coordinating labor across regions, and translating authority into stone. They reveal confidence, but they also reveal the cost of maintaining that confidence. In the next chapter, we follow the consequences as the centralized model weakens, and Egypt enters a phase of fragmentation. If Chapter 1 showed foundations and Chapter 2 showed peak coordination, Chapter 3 explores what happens when coordination becomes harder to sustain. after the Old Kingdom, Egypt does not vanish. It becomes less centralized. Power that once looked concentrated at the royal center becomes more regional and more contested. In this chapter, collapse means political weakening at the top, not civilizational disappearance. Farming, local religion, and daily work continue, even while central authority loses coherence. Late Old Kingdom institutions depended on stable extraction, administrative discipline, and broad acceptance of central priorities. As pressure increased, local systems could keep operating while the center became less effective. Regional officials, often called nomarchs, were already part of governance. During fragmentation, their local offices could become stronger political bases. Administration remained, but control became more dispersed. The first intermediate period reflects that dispersion. Competing centers such as Heracleopolis and Thebes advanced rival claims. This was not simply chaos, it was political reorganization under stress. Later literary traditions often describe this era as disorder and inversion. Those texts matter, but they also reflect later political agendas. Reunified governments had reasons to portray earlier fragmentation negatively. Archaeological evidence points to variation by region. Some zones saw deeper instability. Others retained local continuity. Core Nile lifeways persisted. Cultivation, storage, exchange, ritual practice, and local administration. This is an important historical pattern. A centralized state can weaken while social rhythms persist. Political maps change faster than agricultural cycles and household structures. Causation remains debated. Environmental fluctuations may have added pressure. Fiscal stress and elite competition clearly mattered. A balanced interpretation is multi-causal. Ecological, institutional, and political factors interacted over time. A single cause story is not persuasive here. Egypt did not shift because of one isolated event. The transition appears cumulative, with stress building inside a concentrated system. The paradox is clear. Strong centralization enables large achievements, but concentrated systems can become vulnerable when trust, revenue, or administrative cohesion decline. Even during rivalry, shared Egyptian symbolic language endured. Competing rulers still claimed legitimate continuity. That continuity made later reunification possible. So this period should be understood as transitional, not empty. The first intermediate period is a phase of fragmentation, adaptation, and preserved cultural frameworks beneath political instability. Chapter 4 follows the next step, reunification and Middle Kingdom renewal. One way to understand the first intermediate period is to move away from palace-centered chronology and look at provincial behavior. Local governors did not wait passively for instructions from a weakened court. They negotiated grain storage, irrigation repair, and regional security with the resources they controlled. In inscriptions, some officials emphasized that they fed their districts during scarcity and protected local order when wider politics were uncertain. These claims can be self-serving, but they still reveal what counted as legitimate leadership in a fragmented age: practical care, stable provisioning, and visible guardianship. Funerary culture also changed in ways that matter. Elite display did not disappear, but it became more regionally varied. Tomb art, local titles, and memorial language show adaptation rather than silence. When central authority thins, symbols often become locally anchored. That does not mean cultural rupture. It means national forms are being translated into provincial versions. For listeners, this helps dissolve the old image of a dark interlude. Egypt in this phase looks less like collapse into nothing and more like a redistribution of initiative. The Theban rise illustrates this dynamic. Southern rulers built authority gradually, combining military capacity, alliances, and ideological framing that promised restored balance. Their project was not only conquest, it was reunification with a narrative. Egypt had a proper order. That order had been disrupted, and legitimate kingship would repair it. This language proved durable because it linked political ambition to social desire for predictability. By the end of this period, institutions had not been recreated from zero. They had been reassembled from surviving parts: local administration, scribal practice, ritual authority, and transport networks that still connected the valley. That is the deeper lesson. Fragmentation was real, but continuity survived inside it. The Middle Kingdom did not emerge from emptiness. It emerged from a landscape where local systems had kept enough knowledge alive for centralization to return. After fragmentation, Egypt did not simply return to an earlier model. It rebuilt central authority in a new context. That is the core of the Middle Kingdom story. The first intermediate period had increased regional autonomy and weakened central coordination. When Theban-led reunification advanced, linked to Mentuhotep II, the task was larger than military victory. The state had to restore routine governability. Governability means repeated systems working again. Taxation, storage, transport, local administration, legal mediation, labor coordination, and public legitimacy. Reunification is successful only when these routines become reliable. The Middle Kingdom appears strong because this reliability improved. Regional actors remained important, but they operated inside a more coherent central framework. Local power did not disappear, it was reorganized. Border policy also became more structured. Nubia mattered for security, trade, and political prestige. Fortified zones and managed routes show long-term planning, not only occasional reaction. Internal provisioning remained fundamental. In a Nile-based economy, political authority depended on practical control of resources and distribution. Administrative capacity and legitimacy were tightly linked. Cultural confidence during this period is visible in texts that reflect on order, justice, and kingship. This matters historically. The state was not only governing, it was also articulating why governance should be accepted as rightful. At the same time, the Middle Kingdom should not be romanticized as permanent calm. Rebuilt states often remain alert to risk, elite competition, fiscal pressure, frontier volatility, and administrative drift. Lineages such as Amenemhat and Senusret strengthened continuity, but the durability of the period came from institutions as much as from rulers. Seen as a long arc, this chapter shows institutional learning. Old Kingdom concentration produced great outcomes. Fragmentation exposed vulnerabilities. Middle Kingdom renewal rebuilt coherence with stronger integration and control. That renewal was substantial but not final. Regional pressures kept evolving, especially around Delta access and external movement. Those trends prepare the transition to Chapter 5. So the main takeaway is simple. The Middle Kingdom was a successful reconstruction of central rule built from lessons of earlier breakdown and sustained by administrative competence as much as by royal authority. Middle Kingdom renewal is most visible when we track how reunification became policy, not merely victory. Rulers based at Thebes inherited a country with strong regional identities and uneven capacities. To govern effectively, they had to rebuild trust and central coordination while preserving useful local competence. Administrative reform appears in taxation, provincial oversight, and renewed investment in infrastructure. Officials were expected to serve a broader state project, but they were also evaluated by whether irrigation worked, supplies moved, and disputes were managed before they destabilized whole districts. State confidence in this era appears in writing as well as institutions. Literary compositions associated with the Middle Kingdom, including wisdom texts and narratives about disorder and restoration, helped define political memory. These works do more than praise rulers. They articulate anxieties about instability and present order as an achievement requiring vigilance. In that sense, literature becomes part of governance. It teaches what good rule looks like, what social obligations matter, and why institutional continuity should be protected. Economic life broadened through projects in the Fayum and continued management of agricultural output. Better control of water and land translated into more reliable surplus, which supported administration, temples, and military activity. At the same time, Egypt intensified contacts with Nubia, where fortresses and trade supervision served both security and economic goals. Frontier policy in this period was not only defensive, it was administrative expansion into strategic corridors. What makes the Middle Kingdom historically important is its balance. It is neither the monumental concentration of the early Pyramid Age nor the imperial scale of the New Kingdom. It is a mature phase of consolidation, practical governance, cultural reflection, and selective expansion. For a sleep history lens, this chapter offers a calm but decisive idea. Restoration can be creative. Reunified Egypt did not simply restore old forms, it adapted them, producing institutions and narratives strong enough to shape the centuries that followed. After the Middle Kingdom, Egypt became politically divided again. This period is often called the Second Intermediate Period, and it includes Hyksos power in the Delta. The simplest version of the story is misleading. It was not a single instant where Egypt vanished and then reappeared. It was a gradual shift in a landscape already under pressure. Hyksos authority linked to avarice grew in strategic northern zones where central control had weakened. This was a political consolidation process, not pure sudden replacement of all existing structures. Egyptian institutions continued in the south, especially around Thebes. Governance, cult practice, and royal claims remained active. The map was divided, but Egyptian political culture persisted. The Delta had long ties with Levantine regions through trade and movement. Hyksos' rule should be read within that connected world. Foreign-linked elites still had to govern through Egyptian administrative and symbolic expectations. So this chapter is not only about conflict, it is also about adaptation. Rule in Egypt required practical institutions, revenue systems, and recognizable legitimacy. North-South rivalry intensified over time because competing claims to unified kingship could not remain stable forever. Reunification later became both political goal and ideological project. Narratives associated with Amos and early New Kingdom memory framed the era as foreign domination followed by rightful expulsion. That framing shaped later identity and security thinking. Those memory texts are important, but they are also political. Reunified states often describe earlier fragmentation in strong moral terms to legitimize current rule. Military adaptation in this context matters, including broader tactical and technological exchange with Near Eastern worlds. The key idea is strategic learning. Contested Delta control changed how later rulers defined security. Everyday life remained uneven rather than uniformly catastrophic. Some regions suffered more disruption. Others preserved continuity in farming, ritual life, and local administration. The Hyksos moment is therefore a transition phase, divided sovereignty, mixed political forms, and institutional continuity under tension. Chapter 6 follows the result of that transition, New Kingdom expansion, and a more outward-looking state strategy. The Hyksos period is often told as a simple story of foreign domination and national humiliation. The reality is more layered. In the Delta, rulers with Levantine connections established authority through existing Egyptian administrative forms while introducing new military emphases, especially around horse-drawn chariots and composite bows. This was not the replacement of one civilization by another in a single stroke. It was a mixed political environment where local Egyptian traditions and external influences interacted under unequal power conditions. For people living in this era, daily life likely continued with familiar obligations: cultivation, taxation, temple routines, family work, and local exchange. Political sovereignty changed at the top, but social rhythms did not reset overnight. This distinction matters because it explains why later reunification was possible. If institutions, scribal habits, and regional elites remain active, political reversal has foundations to build on. The southern Theban polity framed resistance in both strategic and ideological terms. Campaigns by Sekanre Tau, Kamose, and eventually Amose are remembered as military turning points, but military action was tied to state-building aims: recover strategic routes, control the delta, restore central legitimacy, and prevent future fragmentation under outside-backed powers. War, in other words, was part of institutional reconstruction. Hyksos' rule also accelerated learning. Egyptian military organization after reunification incorporated techniques and technologies sharpened during this period. The new kingdom did not emerge despite this confrontation. It emerged partly because the confrontation forced adaptation. That is the chapter's core value. Foreign rule brought coercion and instability, but it also triggered structural change that later supported expansion. The past here is not comforting, yet it is historically clarifying. Pressure can reorganize states, and reorganization can reshape the next era. The new kingdom grows from a clear lesson. Divided control had made Egypt vulnerable. Reunification solved part of the problem, but rulers now aimed to secure a wider strategic space. That is why expansion mattered. It was not only prestige, it was also deterrence, route control, and resource strategy. Campaigns in Nubia and the Levant were linked to long-term security planning. Amos is often used as a starting figure, but the broader shift happened over multiple reigns. Egypt built institutions for sustained external projection, not just occasional campaigns. Empire required systems, not only armies. Supply lines, garrisons, communications, fiscal records, and administrative oversight were all necessary to maintain influence across distance. Nubia became a key zone because it combined security value with access to important wealth networks, including gold circulation that supported royal and temple power. In the Levant, control was more variable. Egyptian policy mixed force, alliances, negotiated submission, and diplomacy. Influence was continuous even when direct control was uneven. Diplomacy is therefore central in this chapter. New Kingdom Egypt operated in a multipolar regional environment where treaties, correspondence, and elite exchange mattered alongside military pressure. At home, expansion changed institutions. Military administrative structures expanded, revenue and redistribution systems widened, temples and elite households gained from imperial flows, sometimes strengthening local power as much as central authority. This creates a familiar paradox. Imperial success can increase legitimacy and wealth, while also increasing long-term governance burdens. Rulers such as Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Amenhotep, and Ramses represent different styles within the same strategic framework. Some reigns emphasized campaigns. Others emphasized exchange, monumental projection, or diplomatic positioning. Kadesh-era memory illustrates how imperial politics works through narrative as well as force. States govern outcomes and the story of outcomes at the same time. For ordinary people, empire was not abstract. It affected taxation, labor, recruitment, and redistribution. Imperial policy translated into everyday obligations. So New Kingdom expansion should be understood as effective but costly. It increased Egypt's reach and influence, while also multiplying commitments that later rulers had to sustain. The next chapter shifts to religion and social life, where temples and priestly institutions help explain how imperial-era power was organized and experienced within Egypt itself. New kingdom expansion transformed Egypt from a primarily valley-centered kingdom into an imperial power with wider strategic horizons. Campaigns into the Levant and Nubia were not random displays of royal energy. They were linked to security logic, tribute extraction, prestige competition, and control over trade corridors that moved metals, timber, luxury goods, and constilled labor. Empire required armies, but it also required accountants, diplomats, and administrators capable of converting military outcomes into durable revenue. The reign of Thutmose III is often highlighted for campaign success, yet the long-term significance lies in systems. Garrisons, vassal arrangements, and tribute schedules turned episodic victories into repeatable structures. Later, the Amarna letters reveal a diplomatic world of correspondence, gift exchange, and strategic bargaining among great powers. These archives show Egypt operating in a multipolar environment where prestige, language, and practical negotiation coexisted. Imperial wealth flowed back into temple complexes, court culture, and monumental building. That circulation reinforced legitimacy at home. Victories abroad funded visible order within Egypt, while ritualized kingship framed expansion as cosmic maintenance rather than mere extraction. The ideological message was clear: the king secures boundaries, receives tribute, and redistributes prosperity under divine mandate. Whether people accepted that message uniformly is another question, but the state invested heavily in making it persuasive. Empire also brought strain. Distance, logistical costs, and shifting alliances made frontier management expensive. Military commitments had to be synchronized with domestic provisioning and internal political balance. This dual burden helps explain why imperial peaks are difficult to sustain indefinitely. Still, the new kingdom remains a high point of Egyptian international influence. It demonstrates what happens when inherited institutions, military adaptation, and diplomatic sophistication align long enough to project power well beyond the Nile Valley. This chapter moves from expansion to internal life. In ancient Egypt, religion was not only private belief, it was also institutional structure. Temples were sacred centers, but they also managed land, labor, storage, and redistribution. Ritual and administration worked together. Mat, often understood as order and balance, linked kingship to sacred legitimacy. Political authority was presented as maintenance of this order. Major cults of Amun, Ra, and Osiris were supported by large institutional networks. In places like Thebes, temple systems became central to social organization. Temple estates had economic weight, agricultural output, and labor obligations moved through temple administration. Offerings had symbolic meaning and material consequences. Priesthood was structured and ranked. Priests held specific duties often tied to broader elite and administrative networks. Temple service was organized, not only mystical. Religious institutions provided continuity across political change. Rulers changed, but ritual calendars and temple routines often continued. At the same time, religion was lived locally. Household devotion, small shrines, amulets, and practical prayers were part of daily life. Official and local practice overlapped. So Egyptian religion was both shared and varied, common symbolic frameworks with local differences in practice. As temple institutions grew wealthier, they could gain political influence. That creates a long-term state tension. Institutions that support central power can also become autonomous centers of power. This chapter therefore links imperial history and social history. Expansion could strengthen temple endowments. Temple endowments could shift internal balances. Internal balances could affect long-term state resilience. The key takeaway is straightforward. In Egypt, religion functioned as social infrastructure, shaping legitimacy, resources, and daily order. The next chapter turns to everyday material life in more detail: cities, work, and households. To understand Egyptian religion, it helps to leave the image of isolated monuments and enter the rhythm of practice. Temples were economic centers, ritual theaters, archives, and employment hubs at once. Priests performed scheduled rites that woke divine statues, offered food and incense, maintained sacred spaces, and renewed cosmic order through repetition. These acts were not occasional spectacles. They were daily labor, carried out with procedural precision. Most people did not enter the innermost temple areas, yet temple life still shaped everyday experience. Processions, festivals, local shrines, household offerings, and amuletic practices linked formal theology to ordinary concerns: health, fertility, protection, justice, and memory of the dead. Religion in Egypt was therefore both centralized and distributed. Great state cults projected royal legitimacy, while local devotion translated belief into personal routine. Priestly offices carried status, but also practical obligations. Managing temple estates meant overseeing land, labor, storage, and redistribution. Scribal records tracked donations, inventories, and ceremonial schedules. In periods of strong central rule, temple and crown could reinforce one another. In periods of strain, temple wealth and influence could become politically significant in their own right. This relationship between sacred authority and state authority is one of the great recurring themes of Egyptian history. What endures in this chapter is not only doctrine but cadence. Repeated rituals stabilized social time. Monthly observances, seasonal festivals, and life cycle ceremonies gave communities shared markers beyond political events. In a civilization that lasted millennia, that rhythmic structure mattered deeply. It helped people interpret uncertainty and continuity without needing constant institutional redesign. Belief was lived through practice, and practice helped hold society together. This chapter focuses on ordinary life. Ancient Egypt was socially layered, so daily experience differed by role, status, and place. Most people still lived by agricultural rhythms. Nile cycles shaped planting, harvest, storage, and risk. Even urban institutions depended on these foundations. Rural households had to manage both family survival and institutional obligations. Seasonal labor often served household needs and state temple demands at the same time. Urban centers concentrated administration, craft production, and redistribution. They were places where institutional power became practical through records and resource flow. Scribes were key to this process. Writing converted production into obligations, taxes, labor assignments, deliveries, and legal claims. Artisans and skilled workers linked everyday labor to visible outputs. Their work depended heavily on institutional patronage and organized supply systems. Evidence from places like Deir el-Medina shows socially complex labor communities with records of wages, disputes, devotion, illness, and household concerns. Households remain the core unit of social continuity. Food preparation, childcare, textile work, and local exchange were essential economic activities. Women's labor was central in this household economy, even when official inscriptions emphasized male office holders. Hierarchy was structural. Access to land, office, and legal influence was unequal. Still, lower status groups adapted through local networks, mediation, and practical negotiation. Temple and state institutions could support and constrain at once. They organized work and redistribution, but also extracted labor and resources. Religion was part of daily coping, not only elite ceremony. Household shrines, amulets, and local festivals connected ordinary concerns with wider sacred meanings. The key takeaway is that Egyptian continuity depended on repeated daily competence as much as on elite authority. Households and workers sustained social order through ongoing adaptation. Chapter 9 then moves to an elite-level rupture, the Amarna reforms and their political religious consequences. Daily life in Egypt was structured by labor, season, and household obligation. Most people worked close to agriculture, directly or indirectly, because agricultural surplus supported everything else: administration, priesthood, craft specialization, transport, and military provisioning. Rural calendars followed water and heat, with tasks shifting between field preparation, sowing, maintenance, and harvest processing. Yet Egyptian life was not only rural. Towns and work settlements concentrated artisans, builders, scribes, and traders. Workshops produced textiles, pottery, metal tools, furniture, and ritual goods. Skill moved through apprenticeship, imitation, and correction over years. A finished object represented not just material, but discipline, technique, and social organization. Craft production linked household economies to temple demand and state projects. Writing sat at the center of coordination. Scribes recorded rations, deliveries, labor attendance, legal disputes, and tax obligations. Literacy was unevenly distributed, but its administrative effects touched everyone. A household's access to grain, exemption, or burden could depend on what was written, by whom, and under what authority. Record culture therefore shaped justice as much as efficiency. Trade and movement connected these worlds. Boats carried grain, stone, timber, livestock, and people along the Nile. Desert routes added links for minerals and exchange with neighboring regions. Markets were not modern free systems, but negotiated spaces embedded in social rank and institutional oversight. The result was a dense, practical civilization where ordinary routines made large-scale history possible. This chapter reminds us that empires and monuments rest on repeated daily work. When modern audiences imagine ancient societies, they often assume women had little legal standing. Egypt complicates that assumption. Social hierarchy was real and deeply unequal, but legal documents show women buying property, inheriting assets, initiating divorce in some contexts, and appearing as named participants in contracts. Family was the core social unit. Households were economic, emotional, and legal spaces at once. Work, childcare, food preparation, textile production, and local exchange were not separate worlds. They were intertwined routines that sustained wider institutions. A strong state still depended on stable homes. Marriage in Egypt was often practical rather than ceremonial in the modern sense. Households were formed through agreements, shared residence, and material arrangements. Dowry-like transfers, property expectations, and inheritance planning helped reduce conflict between families. Contracts and written acknowledgments made obligations visible. Inheritance is especially revealing. Property did not always pass in a simple male-only line. Records suggest flexible arrangements shaped by local custom, family strategy, and legal documentation. Mothers, daughters, sons, siblings, and extended kin could all become important in transmission of land, goods, and rights. This legal flexibility did not create equality in status. Elite men still dominated high state offices, military command, and major public authority. Yet within civil life, legal personhood for women appears more substantial than in many neighboring societies of similar eras. That distinction matters if we want historical accuracy rather than broad stereotype. Work roles also varied by class and location. Elite women could manage estates, sponsor religious activity, or act through household administrators. Non-elite women worked in agriculture-linked routines, craft support, markets, and domestic production. Labor categories were often mixed, not cleanly separated. Religious life gave women additional visibility. Goddesses held central symbolic roles, and women participated in cultic practice at local and temple levels. The religious sphere did not erase social constraints, but it provided language for dignity, protection, fertility, and moral order within family life. Legal papyri, letters, and settlement records reveal an important historical truth. Daily stability depended on negotiated relationships more than royal decrees alone. Families mediated debt, dispute, support, and succession. In that sense, household governance was a foundation of state governance. Children were raised inside this framework of practical continuity. Skills, stories, ritual habits, and expectations about obligation were transmitted at home before they entered formal institutions. A civilization that lasts millennia requires this intergenerational reliability. As we listen to Egyptian history through this chapter, we move from kings and battles towards social durability. Laws, contracts, kinship obligations, and domestic labor kept communities functioning through both stable and unstable political periods. So the chapter's main point is simple and powerful. Ancient Egypt endured not only because rulers built monuments, but because families maintained legal and social continuity across generations. In the next chapter, we stay close to everyday vulnerability by looking at medicine, illness, and care. Ancient Egyptian medicine combined observation, practical treatment, and ritual language. Modern categories separate science and religion, but in Egypt they often work together. A healer might examine a wound, apply a physical remedy, and also invoke protective formulas. For patients, effectiveness and meaning were not mutually exclusive. Medical papyri such as the Abers and Edwin Smith texts show different registers of knowledge. Some passages list remedies for digestion, skin conditions, or gynecological concerns. Others classify trauma with striking clinical clarity, inspect, diagnose, prognosis, and treatment steps. This structure suggests trained reasoning, not random improvisation. Care depended on materials available in daily life: honey, oils, plant ingredients, minerals, bandaging cloth, and prepared mixtures. Honey in particular appears repeatedly because of its practical antimicrobial properties, even if ancient practitioners explained efficacy in different conceptual terms. Injury treatment was crucial in a labor-intensive society. Agricultural work, quarrying, construction, transport, and craft production all created risk. Splints, wound cleaning, and staged recovery mattered for household survival as much as for military contexts. Illness also had social meaning. Disease could be interpreted as natural imbalance, environmental exposure, spiritual disturbance, or moral tension. These interpretations were not simply superstition. They were frameworks people used to make suffering intelligible and to organize response. Specialized roles existed, but care was distributed. Professional healers, temple personnel, family members, and community networks all participated. Households often provided first-line support before formal intervention. This pattern resembles many pre-modern and even modern systems where institutions and families share medical burden. Women's health appears in notable detail in several texts, including pregnancy-related concerns and reproductive management. While we must avoid overconfidence in interpretation, these sources indicate sustained attention to gynecological knowledge and household-level reproductive care. Mental distress is harder to document directly, yet complaint literature, prayers, and protective practices suggest that emotional suffering, fear, grief, and uncertainty were recognized dimensions of life. Ritual and social support often functioned as psychological care, even without modern terminology. Public health in the modern sense did not exist, but sanitation habits, storage choices, and water management had clear health implications. Settlements with better planning could reduce certain risks, while crowding and contamination increased others. For a long-duration civilization, medicine is a mirror of values. It shows what people feared, what they observed, what they believed could be repaired, and who was expected to provide care. In Egypt, the answer is a layered system, practical technique, written tradition, ritual assurance, and domestic support. This chapter reminds us that ancient life was not only about monumentality, it was also about pain, recovery, and the ordinary courage of people trying to protect one another. Next, we turn to death and afterlife, where care continues in another form, preparation for eternity. Amarna is one of the sharpest ruptures in this series. It is a period where top-level reform moved faster than normal institutional change. Achaemenid Zaten Center program was not only symbolic, it affected which religious and political networks held priority. The move to Amarna marked this shift in visible form. It attempted to create a new center of legitimacy outside older institutional gravity. Older cult institutions, especially those linked to Amun, were economically and administratively powerful. Changing ritual hierarchy therefore had direct political and fiscal consequences. So this chapter is about institutional redistribution as much as belief language. Sources are complex. Contemporary material is stylized, and later accounts are politically selective. Motives remain debated, so a multi-causal reading is safest. The main outcome is clear. The reform was intense but not durable. It did not become Egypt's long-term governing pattern. Durable reform usually needs broad uptake across bureaucracy, elites, local practice, and succession. Amarna appears to have struggled in that wider embedding. Post-Amarna restoration under later rulers, including Tutankhamun, and consolidation under Horemheb, re-centered older frameworks. This was active reconstruction, not simple reversal. Memory politics mattered in that reconstruction. Later regimes curated the past to reduce the legitimacy of the rupture and stabilize current order. Amarna therefore answers a practical question. How far can central authority push symbolic and institutional reform before structural friction pushes back? It also shows resilience. Egyptian systems could absorb shock and recompose continuity. The key takeaway is that Amarna was a short, high-intensity rupture inside a longer arc of institutional persistence. Chapter 10 follows the later trajectory, where prestige remains visible, but structural strain grows. The Amarna episode stands out because it combines religious innovation, political centralization, and memory conflict in a short span. Akhenaten's court elevated the Aten in ways that challenged established cult balances, reconfigured artistic conventions, and shifted the political center to a new capital at Akhetaten. Whether interpreted as monotheistic revolution or royal concentration strategy, the change was disruptive enough to leave lasting debate. What makes this period especially important is not only the reform itself, but the speed of reversal after Akhenaten. Under Tutankhamun and successors, many traditional cult structures were restored, and official language reframed the Amarna turn as deviation from proper order. Later rulers intensified that framing, sometimes erasing names or redistributing monuments to fold the rupture back into an acceptable narrative of continuity. The Amarna letters add another dimension. While domestic religious policy shifted, international diplomacy remained active and often anxious. Vassals requested support, rival powers negotiated advantage, and frontier politics continued to demand attention. This juxtaposition is revealing. Ideological experimentation at the center coexisted with persistent geopolitical obligations that could not be suspended. As a historical lesson, Amarna demonstrates how states manage memory after disruption. Restoration is rarely neutral. It selects, edits, and reorders the past to stabilize the present. Egypt did not forget Amarna completely, but it domesticated it, turning rupture into cautionary chapter. For listeners, this is the key insight. Political systems survive not only by governing resources, but by governing interpretation. The Ramesside period still looked strong. Monumental projects in royal language projected continuity and power. But visible prestige and practical capacity can separate. This chapter explains that separation. Late New Kingdom governance carried high costs, army commitments, frontier management, temple support, administration, and elite patronage. These obligations required stable revenue and strong coordination. As pressure increased, that coordination became harder. Fiscal stress made extraction and redistribution less reliable, which weakened trust across institutions. Temple and elite networks remained important, but distributed influence could also limit central flexibility. This did not mean sudden collapse. It meant growing friction, slower decisions, harder enforcement, and more contested resource management. External conditions also became less stable. Wider Eastern Mediterranean disruptions affected trade, security, and political alignment. The core issue is systemic volatility, not one single event. Under these conditions, even defensive success could be costly. Tactical resilience could coexist with strategic fatigue. At local scale, strain appeared in practical forms: uneven provisioning, labor tension, and variable enforcement. Communities adapted, but adaptation did not fully restore central coherence. So decline here is cumulative, not instantaneous. Authority thinned unevenly across regions while symbolic kingship remained visible. Continuity still persisted. Religious institutions, local governance patterns, and cultural memory outlasted shifts in central state capacity. The chapter's key point is simple. Ramesside prestige remained real, but the system supporting that prestige became increasingly difficult to sustain. Chapter 11 then asks what survived beyond this political phase and how Egyptian civilization continued under changing rulers and structures. The Ramesside Age project's grandeur, monumental temples, military imagery, and famous royal names. But beneath that prestige, long-term pressures accumulated. Campaigning, construction, temple endowments, and court display all required resources that had to be extracted, transported, and administered year after year. High visibility can mask structural fatigue for a time, yet fatigue eventually appears in delayed payments, local unrest, and weakened central control. Ramesses II's long reign exemplifies both strength and cost. Diplomatic achievements, including the treaty with the Hittites after Kadesh, show strategic flexibility as well as battlefield limits. Monumental programs reinforced legitimacy and memory, but they also signaled how much the system depended on continual mobilization. Success was real, yet expensive. Later decades revealed sharper strain. External pressure in the Eastern Mediterranean, disruptions in wider trade networks, and internal competition among elites complicated governance. The well-known workers' strike at Deir el-Medina, often cited as one of the earliest documented labor actions, highlights practical breakdown. When rations fail, even highly skilled state workers resist. Such episodes reveal how macro-political stress reaches everyday life. The chapter's core argument is that decline here is prolonged, not sudden. Institutions do not vanish overnight. They lose coherence unevenly. Some sectors still function impressively while others falter. Understanding the slow erosion prepares us for the late period, where Egypt remains culturally vital but politically contested by shifting powers. Few themes are more associated with Egypt than mummification, yet the deepest story is not technical preservation alone. It is a moral and social vision of continuity. Death was not imagined as simple disappearance. It was transition, and transition required preparation. Mummification techniques changed across periods and social classes. Elite procedures could involve complex treatment, organ handling, resin application, wrapping sequences, and protective amulets. More modest burials followed simpler methods. Variation was large, but the shared aim was recognizable: preserve identity and support safe passage. Funerary industries grew around this aim. Embalmers, coffin makers, painters, scribes, priests, and transport workers all participated. Death created economic activity and specialized labor, linking belief to practical craftsmanship. Texts commonly grouped under the label Book of the Dead were not a single fixed book. They were collections of spells, guidance, and protective formulas adapted for individuals. Choices depended on means, local tradition, and period style. A funerary text was both ritual tool and curated statement of hope. Afterlife ethics mattered deeply. The famous judgment scene where the heart is weighed against Maat expresses an enduring principle: social behavior in life has consequences beyond life. Truthfulness, fairness, restraint, and respect for order are framed as existential requirements, not merely civic virtues. Tombs were therefore more than memorial containers. They were designed environments for memory, offering exchange and symbolic renewal. Inscriptions named the dead, scenes depicted ideal sustenance, and visitors could reactivate bonds through spoken offerings. Family roles continued after burial. Descendants maintained cult obligations where possible, preserving names and ritual contact. To be forgotten was a second death in cultural terms. Memory practices helped protect against that loss. Royal burials amplified these patterns with state resources. Valley of the Kings programs, mortuary temples, and elaborate iconography linked kingship to cosmic cycles. Yet the same underlying logic appears at multiple social levels: care, continuity, and moral framing of existence. Over time, external pressure, economic constraints, and political shifts altered funerary practice, but core ideas remained surprisingly durable. Bodies might be prepared differently, texts might be abbreviated, tomb architecture might shift, but concern for post-mortem identity and ethical passage persisted. For listeners, this chapter offers a calm but profound insight. Egyptian civilization treated mortality as a problem to be organized, not denied. Through craft, text, ritual, and memory, people created structures to carry meaning across death. In the next chapter, we move to Alexandria and the late intellectual world, where Egyptian continuity meets Greek scholarship and a changing Mediterranean. When we reach Alexandria, Egyptian history does not end. It changes scale and language. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt became a major Mediterranean center where Egyptian traditions, Greek political forms, and wider imperial networks met in one evolving system. Alexandria was a planned urban project with symbolic ambition. Its harbor, institutions, and court culture projected power outward while drawing resources inward from the Nile Valley. Rural Egypt remained the productive base, but urban concentration reshaped how authority was displayed and coordinated. The famous library and Mausian represent one side of this world: scholarship, cataloging, commentary. mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and textual criticism, even allowing for later legend. The scholarly culture of Alexandria marks a major experiment in organized knowledge. Yet intellectual prestige rested on administrative extraction. Tax systems, grain management, legal hierarchy, and military enforcement connected countryside and city. Governance was multilingual and layered, Greek in many official channels, Egyptian practices enduring in temple and local life, and legal pluralism negotiated through status and context. Religious life also hybridized. New cult forms emerged, including Serapis, while long-standing Egyptian temple traditions remained active. This was not simple replacement, it was selective integration under unequal political conditions. Economic significance expanded through grain exports and trade circulation. Egypt's agricultural productivity made it strategically central in Mediterranean politics. Control of Egyptian grain became a geopolitical asset for rulers far beyond the Nile. The Ptolemaic Cape period also saw tension, elite competition, local revolts, fiscal pressure, and court instability. Cleopatra VII, often reduced to dramatic biography, should also be understood within this structural context of imperial rivalry and domestic constraints. Roman annexation in 30 BCE altered sovereignty but preserved many administrative and economic continuities. Egypt remained crucial to imperial supply, and Egyptian cultural forms continued to evolve under new political masters. By ending with Alexandria, we see the long arc more clearly. Egypt is not a sealed ancient chapter. It is a dynamic civilization that repeatedly translated itself across political regimes while retaining deep cultural grammar. This final chapter closes the series with a balanced perspective. Continuity without romanticizing stasis, change without erasing inheritance. Ancient Egypt endured because it adapted, and it adapted because institutions, memory, and daily practice remained capable of renewal. As the ambience continues, let that be the final thought. Civilizations do not survive by remaining unchanged. They survive by changing in ways that preserve meaning. Egypt did this for millennia, and its long echo remains with us still. After the Ramesside period, Egypt entered repeated political transitions. Rule changed hands many times, but Egyptian civilization did not vanish. This chapter's core idea is simple. State forms changed faster than cultural and institutional continuity. Late phases included multiple ruling layers, internal and external. The key pattern is that new powers often governed through existing Egyptian structures rather than replacing all of them at once. Temple institutions remain major anchors of continuity. They sustained ritual life, economic organization, and local legitimacy through changing regimes. Writing and administrative traditions also adapted without disappearing. Continuity came through modification, not exact repetition. Later frameworks, including Persian and then Ptolemaic rule, brought major political change. New centers such as Alexandria became important in wider Mediterranean systems. Even with those changes, older Egyptian sacred and social structures persisted. Foreign rule altered power relations but did not automatically erase Egyptian institutional life. Daily continuity mattered. Households still managed land, labor, ritual obligations, and local exchange under shifting political overlays. So this is not a story of one clean fall. It is a story of layered transformation with real ruptures, but also durable persistence. By the end of the arc, Egypt is transformed and still recognizable. Its long legacy survives in institutions, symbols, and memory transmitted across centuries. That is why ancient Egypt remains historically present, not as an unchanged state, but as a civilization capable of continuity through repeated political change. Late Egypt is sometimes described only as a sequence of foreign rulers. That framing misses continuity. Political sovereignty changed repeatedly. Libyan dynasts, Nubian kings, Assyrian interventions, Persian administrations, and eventually Macedonian and Ptolemaic control. But Egyptian institutions, ritual forms, and visual language continued to shape governance and identity. Nubian rule in the 25th dynasty, for example, did not simply overwrite Egyptian tradition. It consciously engaged with earlier Egyptian models, restoring and reframing older forms of kingship and temple patronage. Persian administrations introduced imperial practices, yet they also worked through local structures where necessary. Power shifted, but negotiation with established cultural systems remained unavoidable. The Ptolemaic transition extends this pattern. Greek-speaking elites ruled a predominantly Egyptian landscape, producing hybrid administrative and religious worlds. Temples remained major institutions. Bilingualism and legal plurality expanded. Urban and rural experiences diverged in new ways. Continuity and change operated together rather than in separate chapters. What endured most strongly was civilizational grammar, ritual calendars, sacred geography, scribal memory, funerary expectation, and the symbolic authority of the Nile-centered past. Even when rulers changed, these frameworks shaped legitimacy and everyday meaning. So the final lesson is not that Egypt ended abruptly. It transformed through layered transitions while carrying forward a remarkably persistent cultural core. That persistence, more than any single dynasty, explains Egypt's long afterlife and historical memory.